Hello. Good to be back in our second meeting. We're going to be talking today about religion and family in American Jewry, American Judaism, and actually want to introduce it by moving from our previous meeting and looking at an article that appeared in the New York Post in right before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year of 2024 of 5785. Tal Fortgang, I don't know him, but apparently an Israeli immigrant to America, writes an article, Why I'm So Grateful to Be an American on This Rosh Hashanah. And he discusses how, despite everything that's gone on and the rise of anti-Semitism, etc., he says, but as an American Jew, I can also be thankful for a lot. Most of all, I reflect on how lucky I am to live amongst Americans. And then he goes on to praise people who supported him and praise the country, etc. And these are lovely feelings that he had the privilege of having, but they really move into that idea that I ended with last time about how exceptionalism and it being sort of part of the fabric of American Jewish identity is something which is very attractive, and I don't think it means blind faith in a sort of American patriotic way, but nonetheless, it's something that people desire. People look for reinforcement of the sense that America is a place where Jews can thrive, where Jews feel safe, where Jews can adjust their Judaism in ways which are enable them to straddle or to integrate or to balance between their Judaism and their sense of being fully rooted in the American culture and life and society. And I would even say in this case here, we're going to talk a lot about how that comes to fruition through creativity. So here, I want to start actually by setting some of the cornerstones of American religion. Maybe just beforehand, I'm going to go back for a second just to that opening slide because I want to do what I did last time, is to set the parameters through questions and through argument. Okay, so my two questions that I want to ask in this meeting are, what are the unique elements of American Judaism as it comes to American Judaism, religion? What things mark it, and then to explore how those characteristics of American religion play out in some of the ways that American Jewish family life has evolved, focusing mostly on issues of marrying with people who are not Jews, and trying to do that in a way which is analytical and which is certainly non-judgmental. So the argument that I want to advance here, or the terms that I think are useful here, are the interplay between comfort and creativity. Two C's: comfort, creativity. Americanization has a comfort level to it, has an ability to allow Jews in. There's a desire certainly to allow Jews in. Often it comes to fruition, other times more difficult. But America also has a side to it which relates to its religion and to other characteristics that allows for creativity. It's really fascinating, in my opinion, to see how some of that religious creativity interplays with that Americanization in different ways. And we're going to give different examples. So now let's start with some of the foundations of American religion in general and how a person I believe to be one of the great historians of Judaism in general and of American Judaism in particular, Jonathan Sarna, lays them out. I'll refer to Sarna today. I'll refer to some of the other great historians of the last period. So if we go to his opening of his book, American Judaism, published originally in Yale University Press, 2004. He talks about 5 issues which characterize American religion and how the Jews really resonated with them. So he says, the world of American religion extended the boundaries of legitimate faiths to embrace Jews in new ways. Privileges once accorded only the favored denominations of Protestants now applied far more broadly. So every religious faith in principle in America was given freedom and the ability to express itself. But how did these come out? So religious freedom, we said that's number 1. Church-state separation, which basically means that the government does not support financially or otherwise in any official way another specific religious creed denomination. That doesn't mean that Christianity isn't the dominant religion in America till today, and it is very much a religious country in many ways and a Christian country in terms of its culture, but nonetheless there is no official church like you have till today in France, like you have till today in England, like you certainly had historically in many, many places. Denominationalism is huge, and some people don't love that term, but basically the idea that there are many different factions. Like I said in the previous class, the previous lecture meeting, Puritans came, and Quakers came, and Huguenots came, and Baptists came, and Catholics came, and they didn't have a real easy time of it at the beginning. But Christianity has lots of different divisions, and none of them was in charge officially, even though, except for Biden and previously JFK, John F. Kennedy, all the other presidents were from some Protestant group. So Jews, in that sense, number 1, are another faction. Clearly, they have some significant ethnic differences, but nonetheless and theological differences, but nonetheless another faction. But also within Judaism, it can be diverse, and there isn't one Judaism. There are 3 or 4 dominant movements initially, and then sort of freestyle, and lots of different stuff comes out, and that sort of plays into the issue I already raised of creativity. Number 4, voluntarism. That is critical. Voluntarism means that there is no religious coercion. And Alexis de Tocqueville, in his 1832 classic, Democracy in America, this French statesman who comes to America, he sees these churches busting with people, but nobody's forced to go to church. The government doesn't pay for the churches, as opposed to his native France, where there is a little more coercion, and there's certainly government sponsorship. And the churches, he says, are empty. The Catholic churches are empty. Voluntarism says no religious coercion, but it also means, and I think this is the most important part and plays into the creativity, it means that religions have to try hard, because nobody's got to get there. So if you want to fill the pews, you want to fill the benches, you want people to come in, you want people to come to activities, you want people to pray, you want people to pay membership, you want people to be involved, you got to make it attractive. You got to make it interesting. You got to appeal to where they are at that moment. You can't be static. You have to be dynamic, and you have to find ways to market. It's a capitalistic society, and marketing is something which is inbred early on, and that voluntarism and that market orientation are critical to American life. And I recall very cogently Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in the early 1990s coming to Israel and talking about how would Alexis de Tocqueville look at Israeli society, which is predicated on an official rabbinate and official Christian and Muslim groups, which are all subsidized by the state, and how different that was from the sort of voluntarism that he celebrated in America. And certainly food for thought for long term, but just a side comment. And then patriotism. And this goes back to that Americanization that we talked about. The famous phrase that actually sort of influenced Jews to move it from separate seating in the liberal denominations, Reform and then conservative, to mixed gender seating. A family that prays together stays together. Going to church or going to synagogue or being part of religious life is an act of being an American. Later on the dollar bills and on the coins, in God we trust. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. God and religion, at least in principle, are part and parcel of patriotism that enables Jews to feel sometimes like they might want to be in the other religions, but more so to sort of figure out how to adjust their religion their own religion so it manifests that patriotism. And you have that in the Reform, the Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionists to a certain degree. From the 1960s, there are changes in that, and we'll talk about some of those changes, but certainly that is at the foundation. It also has to do with prejudices, and there's certainly a trope in America within anti-Semitism that real patriots are Christians. And that's certainly something that comes up, but we're not going to be focusing on that in this session. So these 5 principles, religious freedom, church-state separation, denominationalism, voluntarism, and patriotism, are foundational, and we are going to refer back to them here and there. And now we're going to look a little bit at the major denominations and some of these issues. And I want to say again, we had, as we saw in the last session, we had the Sephardic immigration, and they had sort of took their European, Spanish, Portuguese framings from Amsterdam, from Hamburg, from places where there were London, where there were Sephardic communities, and moved them over to America. And in a way, we could call that kind of colonial, kind of old world, kind of peripheral. What I'm focusing on here is on things that are new. Of course, they're also related, certainly starting with Reform, which starts in Germany, it starts in Central Europe, but nonetheless, American Reform has a unique character. So, and then we're going to move on to conservative Judaism versions of Orthodox Judaism. I probably should have talked a little bit more about Reconstructionism. I'll mention it in terms of conservative Judaism, but also about New Age and a lot of fascinating creativity that's going on now. Zalman Shlomi Schachter, some of the Carlebachism that has developed, and my dear friend and mentor Jack Wertheimer wrote a really good book a couple of years ago about the new American Judaism. I highly recommend it to really dig deep into that. But again, time frameworks and trying to focus on some key arguments. So let's go now to the Reform movement. And here we have a citation from Michael Meyer, who wrote, till today, the best book on the history of Reform Judaism from Europe to America, to Israel, everywhere. Response to modernity. So he writes, the United States lacked the obstacles that had lain in the path of European reform, while providing an environment which could scarcely have been more conducive. A multitude of denominations and sects competed for adherence in a free market of religions, exactly the sort of those tropes, those themes that that I mentioned already, that were mentioned by Sarna and that I sort of highlighted. So, as he calls one of his key chapters, America is the promised land, the Eretz HaMuftachat, the promised land of Reform Jewry, because it's tabula rasa. There is no established rabbinate in a clear sense. You have the Sephardic Jews, but among the Ashkenazim, no one has a monopoly, no one has control. It's sort of a free-for-all. There aren't many rabbis. And when the German Jews come in from the mid-20th century, mid-19th century, and develop and become economically established, in the 70s, 80s, and onwards, they bring with them a sense that we're Americans. We want to be part of American society, and they, in many ways, Protestantize Judaism in what is called classical Reform Judaism. Classical Reform Judaism does away with any obligatory mitzvot, commandments, focuses on ethics, focuses on God, focuses on the sense of like all monotheistic religions are connected, and as we'll see at next meeting, is completely antagonistic to any idea of eventually moving to a promised land. Religion was less a heritage carried with little reflection from generation to generation than a conscious, voluntary choice. It's a choice to be a Jew in America. And if it's a choice to be a Jew in America, we can construct edifices that are very American, like the one we saw in Charleston, South Carolina. We can adjust the prayer service initially to be in German, later to be in English. We can bring in organs. We can have huge parking lots so people can arrive and park near the synagogue. We can do lots of things, and Reform Judaism is always re-evaluating itself, and it's fascinating how the principle is a dynamic principle of Reform Judaism at each stage, and you could look at different meetings they had in 1885, in 1937, in 1976, in 1999. Reform Judaism often, every couple of decades, says, so where are we now? What do we think about our services, our language, our leadership, our connection to America, our connection to Israel, our sense of anti-Semitism, our sense of obligation, our sense of values, Reform Judaism clearly finds a home in America, and it was very dominant in the late 19th century, but was quickly sort of overwhelmed by the grand immigration of Eastern Europeans who really didn't resonate with Reform Judaism, being overly Germanic, overly, in their opinion, church-like, overly sort of elitist. But of late, as we'll see, related to family, Reform Judaism is sustaining itself in ways that other denominations are having difficulty for interesting ways. But I think Reform Judaism is critical to understanding American Jewry. Another thing that is already in the late 19th century Reform Judaism, but really has become even more central, is the idea of Tikkun Olam, the idea of Judaism essentially being the people who are the light onto the nations, who are here to bring ethical values and kindness and goodness and belief in God, in principle, to the world in a way which is very ecumenical, very universal. Some of that universalism has dissipated a little bit today, but I think that Michael Meyer really characterizes a lot of it, and there's so much more to say, but I think that is some critical moments, and thinking about that comfort to and creativity, wanting to be American, wanting to fit in, wanting that the religion, being a Reformed Jew is being a good American, a family that prays together, stays together. It works. And you can see sort of stereotypical characterizations like driving Miss Daisy about Southern Reform Judaism. There are other types of more critical books and movies, but certainly Reform Judaism is very much in relationship to the evolution and to the dynamism of American life. So too your conservative Judaism, but in different ways. So conservative Judaism has some roots in Germany, in figures like Zachariah Frankel, who looked at Judaism as being obligatory from a halakhic perspective, but being evolutionary. The key figure in conservative Judaism from a theological perspective in America is Solomon Schechter, who was brought from England, a great professor at Cambridge, who was also a rabbinic scholar with a Romanian background, Hasidic background, a great scholar of the Geniza in Cairo, who becomes the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which was established actually as an Orthodox, Americanized Orthodox, kind of modern Orthodox institution, which would combine academic learning with commitment to observance. And some very important early Orthodox rabbis actually were graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary. But eventually it became the flagship institution and the core for conservative Judaism, and conservative Judaism sort of is at a place with these immigrants where it is very traditional, and in principle, it till today believes that Sabbath and kosher laws and all of the basic Passover prohibitions against eating leavened bread, etc., products. Conservative Judaism is a halachic movement. However, it is very much predicated on the idea of evolution, of the voice of the people, of the folk, of the idea of what Solomon Schechter termed Catholic Israel, that the Klal Yisrael, the people, can, through their voice, they've expressed throughout history how Judaism can evolve, and it's very much trying to create something that will be reasonable and livable for traditional-oriented American Jews. This appeals much more to Eastern European Jews, second-generation people whose parents were Orthodox, who came to America, who might work on Saturday or certainly live a sort of more less observant life, but nonetheless, when they go to synagogue, they want to be in a place where the prayer service is in Hebrew, where it reminds them of their roots, and has a strong intellectual base. And the Jewish Theological Seminary is a profound institution that some of the greatest scholars of the 20th century and the 21st century were based there. But one of the most interesting parts of conservative Judaism is its sort of communal structure. And the term that's often used is the synagogue center. Synagogue center is not an exclusive conservative institution. There are Reform synagogue centers, there are Orthodox synagogue centers, but the synagogue center is sort of connected to conservative Judaism because one of the early graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who himself was initially an Orthodox rabbi, but later left Orthodoxy, was Mordechai Kaplan, who eventually even left the conservative movement and founded the fourth denomination, the Reconstructionist movement, which has its own seminary, but for many years was very tied in with the conservative movement. And he discussed what he called Judaism as a civilization. And Judaism as civilization was the idea that actually resonated very much with sort of Zionist tropes, that Judaism isn't expressed just through the parochial, through the synagogue, through the meaning the chapel, the meaning the sanctuary, through ritual law, but rather through the gamut of ways where Jews come together. And here I brought an example that I love from the 1930s. One of the first big Jewish centers was the Brooklyn Jewish Center. It's today actually a Chabad edifice, but at its time it had, as you can see, the membership fees in the Brooklyn Jewish Center are $50 per year. Imagine that. And what are the privileges? Well, you get, it doesn't say anything here about attendance in synagogue. I guess you have to pay extra for the high holiday seats, but there's the speaker's forum, there's the gym, with all the different activities and being a healthy person, just like in Jewish camping. Gymnasiums are real important. Social activities, entertainment, dances, the drama club, the Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies, where there are professor from the Jewish Theological Seminary, which will come and give classes on Bible, on history of Zionism. The conservative movement, as opposed to the Reform movement, is quite pro-Zionist from the get-go. The newsletter, the Hebrew schools, the educational, the bar mitzvah and marriage ceremonies preparation. And what it doesn't say here is the pool and the bowling alley. The Brooklyn Jewish Center was one of those original, what my friend David Kaufman wrote about in his book, a shul with a pool where you could swim during the week and attend the services on Saturday, a kind of ritual Jewish community center all in one. But this, I think, really comes back to that comfort and creativity, making people comfort. It comes back comfortable and being creative about it. How do you make the synagogue a place that people will want to come to, not just twice a year, not just on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? How do you market it? The marketing here. How do you attract people? How do you make it something that will speak to people who want to be Jewish, but they want to be American? And the synagogue center, which is a particularly conservative kind of framing, certainly Kaplan so celebrates it, I think epitomizes that. But you also see orthodoxy, certainly pre World War II, but even 1950s, 60s, 70s, modern orthodoxy, having a lot of similarities to the conservative movement. And indeed, for a long time, there weren't that many differences. And really until the 1950s, when there were big court cases about synagogues that wanted to take down their separation, their mechitza between men and women, and Orthodox shuls became the synagogues where there was separation and separate seating, and conservative synagogues, for the most part, were the ones that were with mixed seating. There was a lot of blurring. So one synagogue which maintained its mechitza, but nonetheless has very much that synagogue center feel, is one of the most prominent modern Orthodox synagogues till today, and they sponsor a school. The synagogue is called Congregation Kilat Jeshurun on 85th Street in the east side of Manhattan. They sponsor a school of Ramaz. I had the privilege of attending that high school, of the high school sponsored by Ramaz, playing on the basketball team, of course, and the tennis team. There's a family, the Looksteins, who they and their patriarch, Rabbi Moses Zebulun Margolis, served in that synagogue for years. And when I was going through their archives for an article that I wrote a bunch of years ago, I found this letter from Rabbi Joseph Lookstein, who was really the key architect in modern Orthodoxy in KJ, but also very involved with the Yeshiva University and Bar Ilan University in Israel, and a big American Orthodox leader. He writes to his son, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, who is over 90 today and is still strong and is still very involved in the synagogue. But in 1968, he writes, Haskell, what we did in 85th Street during our over 40 years of my incumbency, of which you shared 10 with me, was to make conservatism and reform unnecessary. Why? Because they created an orthodoxy that was attractive to Americans, with Thanksgiving services, with sisterhoods, with a gymnasium, with articulate English speeches. And then he writes like this: all this we were able to do because our intention was to conduct the kind of public worship that would be as dignified as the most reform and as pious as the worship in a shtibel. So modern Orthodoxy certainly has roots in Hirschian Orthodoxy of Germany. It certainly has parallels in the United Synagogue of the United Kingdom of England, but the way it sort of celebrates America and Americanization and connection between Jews and America, and in parallel to conservative Judaism is certainly a significant moment. But I would actually argue that probably the most significant contribution or unique contribution of modern Orthodoxy to sort of the history of Jewish life in many ways is the institution Yeshiva University. Yeshiva University was started as a cheder, a school for kids from more traditional homes already in the 1880s, 1886, called Eitz Chaim, and combined with an advanced yeshiva called Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, which was started in 1896. And eventually it transforms into this hybrid institution which exists till today, which is not a seminary which is based on academic studies like the Hebrew Union College of the Reform Movement in Cincinnati, New York, Los Angeles, and Jerusalem, or the Jewish Theological Seminary of the Conservative Movement, or the Reform Reconstructionist institution in Philadelphia. Yeshiva University is like an Eastern European yeshiva in the morning with a study hall with rabbis who look like they still dress very similar to their forebears in Eastern Europe. And then it's a university with all the different humanities and studies, etc. The yeshiva ideal of education is based upon the conviction that we serve our country, which country? America, and humanity best by training the growing generation of our youth to live in the ways of Israel's Torah, its moral standards, and its spiritual ideals. He writes in 1926, Bernard Revel, the first president of the Yeshiva University, a graduate of Lithuanian yeshivas who came to America and got a PhD here in America. Not merely does the future of American Jewry depend upon this strengthening in our youth of the bonds of love and understanding of the ideals and internal truth of Israel, but to a degree, world Jewry is coming to look for its spiritual strength in America. And he goes on to say that after World War I already, 1926, World War I ended in 1918. The Jewish centers are starting to sort of dry up, and this is even before the Holocaust. And he says it is our imperative task to create in this land, in America, a Jewish life inspired and guided by conceptions and teachings, ideals, continuity of Israel, but at the same time, an education through which the human conscience and the Jewish conscience develop harmoniously, as they put it, Torah umada, Torah and science, into the synthesis of a complete Jewish personality. Immortal truth of Judaism, together with the great humanitarian ideals upon which our blessed country is founded. And the reason I think that Yeshiva University is so important is because American Jews know that education is certainly immigrants and the second generation, they want their kids to get a college education. They want their kids to be educated. They see that getting a professional degree, they see that getting advanced degrees gives them a step ahead, gives them ability to go into doctor, lawyer, go into all sorts of professional opportunities, etc., which can advance them. And if an institution doesn't have that, well, just to learn Torah and a little bit of secular studies, Yeshiva University in principle celebrates the highest level of both with continuity. You can be a great American. You can be a successful American. You could contribute to society. In fact, if you add to that your faith and your connection to tradition, you will actually be a better American. So this is a type of different type of play on that comfort, creativity, interplay, or maybe tension or creative tension that we see here. Now we go to the institutions which were created in that fourth immigration here. Haredi Orthodoxy really flourishes after World War II. We talked a little bit about Rabbi Aaron Cutler, but here we have a citation about when he creates his yeshiva in Lakewood, his Beit Medrash Gavoha. He says that We are the generation that is going to revive Judaism, create a renaissance. Our generation, the generation of the destruction, the Chorban, a word which was used to describe the destruction of the temple, that lost the majority of the finest and most outstanding sons during the tragic years of rage. We have to create a place where Jews can learn and study for as long as they want, full time, separate from the pollution of America. But again, he's taking that American tradition of religious groups creating their independent spaces, but he's also saying that America, with all its opportunity, in his perception, the challenges, the draws are tremendous, and he rejects the synthetic approach of yeshiva university directly. And he says, no, as long as you're in my yeshiva, you can't go to college. Because as soon as you go to college, you're going to lose that edge. Now, what is so significant is how Lakewood and in parallel, the Hasidic groups who are less or intellectual oriented, but nonetheless have created their own compromises, have flourished. And these groups are very significant, but for the most part, their approach has been an enclavist. How can we minimize our interaction with society? Very difficult. And if you go to Lakewood today, it looks very different than it did in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. It's a pretty cosmopolitan place. And yes, it definitely has a more conservative air than most other cities in America. Nonetheless, there's diversity. There are Hasidim, there are non-Hasidim. There are the Lithuanians are dominant still, the non-Hasidic, but there are all sorts of schools. There's a recognition that a lot of young Haredi kids go what's called off the derech, don't necessarily follow their parents, and are inspired or are attracted by American culture, and therefore there are all sorts of institutions that have been created to sort of be adjusting. So there is a lot of diversity there, a lot more than what appears to the eye when you look at those black and white, et cetera, that you see from the outside. Nonetheless, the ideal is an enclavist ideal, and it keeps evolving in interesting ways. And one of the interesting ways that I've written about is that they've created community calls. They've created sort of stations around America in places like Dayton, Ohio, and Palo Alto and Atlanta and Houston, Texas, where there's sort of little mini versions of a Lakewood kollel that have been created to sort of strengthen those communities. And that's why Haredi Judaism has gone beyond the Eastern Seaboard in the last half a century or 30 years, certainly. On the other hand, within the ultra-Orthodox Jews, who also, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who founded the American, who didn't found, his father-in-law, the Riatz, Rabbi Isaac Schneerson, came to America before the war, but Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh Lubavitch Rebbe, really transformed a Hasidic movement from Russia, Lithuania, into Ukraine, Russia, really, into a religious movement which has tremendous, profound impact on American Jewry and on world Jewry, Israel, America, throughout, and took the opposite approach, or sort of an adjusted, nuanced approach to that of Cutler. Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson said, every Jewish soul matters. The object is to find the pintaliyah, to find the spark in a Kabbalistic way of every Jew, and to find a way to connect them. And that every time a Jew does even an isolated act of ritual observance, shaking the lulav, the branches on Sukkot, lighting the Shabbat candles, baking the challah for Sabbath, putting on the phylacteries tefillin with their tanks, any type of connection to Judaism is making the world a better place, in their perception, bringing the ultimate redemption. And fascinatingly, we see how this sort of trademark, here is the original Chabad building on 770 Eastern Parkway, but it's sort of become a branding as a global movement. And you see that there are Chabad houses in Los Angeles. There's a Chabad house in the Kfar Chabad in central Israel, but there are Chabad houses in Brazil, there are Chabad houses in Montreal, there are Chabad houses in Melbourne, Australia, there are Chabad houses in Italy, and sort of in a way, in a sort of actually an alternative to Zionism, not a land-based religion, but a global religion. Chabad is a force which has grown and in a way which might have been counterintuitive in the 1990s, since Menachem Mendel Schneerson passed away and he was not replaced, the movement has just grown. And the energy of these shluchim, of these emissaries who go out and are lifers, they don't come to a community for a few years and then look for a bigger shtel or a bigger congregation. They stay in eastern Pennsylvania, or they stay in Northern California, or they stay in Thailand, or they stay in various former Soviet republics, or wherever it be. They establish extensions of Chabad throughout the world, and Chabad is what, in my opinion, a really interesting example of a general American Jewish religious phenomenon, the phenomenon of post-denominationalism. Of a lot of Jews don't want to be called, I am a conservative Jew, I am a Reformed Jew, I am an Orthodox Jew, in the classical sense that worked in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s to some degree. Today, Jews want to be able to live in multiple spaces, and they want to also be spiritually inspired. And the demands that Chabad Shluchim have upon the people who send their kids to their kindergartens or come to their activities. There's actually a big Beit Chabad, which has a dormitory in Rutgers University, fascinating, in New Jersey, a state university where they have a kosher meal plan, and most of the kids who live there are not personally observant. It doesn't have the same sectarian sense, although the hardcore of Chabad still has its base in Brooklyn, and they have ways to sustain a sense of connection so it sort of has, it's sort of like what we'd call a reformist sect, which has an inner part, core, and this outreach thing. And it's very much affected by American free market. The ability to go out there, the ability to adjust the product. What works in Boise, Idaho for my nephew when he was there, working there for a couple of months? What works in Montana when my Bozeman, Montana, when my son and daughter-in-law were traveling through the United States? What works for the Israeli backpackers in Bangkok? Or what works for the expatriates living or those married to native Chinese in Beijing? I've traveled a lot and I've seen a lot of Chabad houses, and each one takes the Chabad core and the Rebbe's ideas and then adjusts it to the appropriate local milieu and population. And sometimes you even have more than one Chabad house for different constituencies. And I think that this definitely has an American creativity to it, a marketing approach, and an approach as nobody's guaranteeing that anyone's going to walk through the door. We have to make this something that is attractive, something inspiring, something that will make people want to come in. And in many ways, Chabad, in many places, is replacing or is an alternative to primarily the conservative and reform temples and synagogues of the past for Jews who are looking for something a little less formal and a little less obligatory. And those studies which don't account for Chabad's impact on Jewish life in America and beyond, I think are lacking, and more work has to be done to look at that more closely. So one last point about religion, then we're going to go quickly into family. And this is sort of a segue. Feminism and the role of women is not something that by any means is particular to Judaism. It's one of the major transformations of the 20th century and in the whole approach to gender is something which is emblematic of the 21st century in the Western world, for sure. And of course, Jews who often very much are attracted to new ideas, especially ones which have a moral claim on them, and the idea of women's equality and women being full partners in every aspect of society is something which is very much appealing to Jews, particularly Jews who see tikkun olam, who see being a light onto the nations, or being an ethically, moral, high ground oriented group as being something that is the epitome of Jewish expression, is something which has sort of been a part of Judaism already throughout the 20th century. And there are isolated examples early on of women becoming involved. A very important Zionist figure, Henrietta Sold, who was the daughter of a traditional kind of conservative rabbi, Benjamin Sold, in Philadelphia, in the early 20th century actually applied to study in the rabbinical school of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And Shalom Schachter said, you can come as long as you don't, you can even take the tests, as long as you don't ask to be granted ordination. Well, she did it, and she was a very knowledgeable Jew. Eventually, she became an important Zionist leader. But by 1972, as the feminist movement in general becomes much more powerful and much more accepted in its later phases, we already have in the 60s strong push for women to have full stature within Reform synagogues, within conservative synagogues. 1972, Sally Priesand, Rabbi Sally Priesand, is the first American woman ordinated. There was a woman, Regina Jonas, who was ordinated already in the early 20th century in Europe. But Sally Priesand is the pioneer, and in the 1880s, big debates within the conservative movement. Has Judaism evolved? Is this part of that evolution? Is there a way to, from a halachic evolutionary perspective, create a foundation for women to be full partners in Jewish life, in leadership, in ritual, in every part? And for the most part, today there is a consensus in non-Orthodox Judaism that from a moral, ethical, ritual, halachic, whatever you say, the non-Orthodox denominations and streams have all internalized full egalitarianism of men, women, and LGBTQs, and any identity as being foundational to what it means to be a Jew. The Orthodox are still debating it. And here I brought one case of a pioneer in this case, is Sarah Horowitz, who is leading a yeshiva for women called Maharat, which trains women, some of them who take the title rabbi like she has more recently, and some who take other titles. But Orthodoxy is still navigating that, and today there are many more opportunities for women, particularly in the modern Orthodox world, or what's called the open Orthodox world, to have roles within synagogues, to give sermons, to be involved, to be leaders, to be looked at as rabbis. There are institutions in Israel as well that are training women rabbis. However, till today, Orthodox halacha does not count women among its quorum, does not count women for certain types of evidence and for leading certain types of prayers. And thus, that halachic boundary is something which is a major distinction, not only between the ultra-Orthodox who have tremendous women educators, but are very clear that women don't have a place within the ritual arena, but within the most progressive, liberal, Orthodox communities as well, in America and in Israel as well. There are a few isolated places in Israel which are more egalitarian. There are places which are hybrid, which are introducing egalitarian places. There's a very well-known synagogue called Shir HaChadashah in Jerusalem. There's a place called Darchei Noam in the west side of Manhattan. Nonetheless, full egalitarianism is still not part and parcel to orthodoxy, and that is a big dividing point and something that will continue to debate and probably evolve, but I don't want to predict. But nonetheless, tremendous creativity. So comfort and creativity, Americanism, American ethics, and American standards come across here. I'm segueing from religion to family. And here I'm taking some symbols. I want to start backwards here and say that if in the early 1960s, 25% of the Jews were married, 15% to 20% of the Jews were married to non-Jews. Today, it's between 50 and 60%. If you take non-Orthodox Jews in America, 70 to 80% of non-Jewish Jews in America marry non-Jews today. And if you go to places like the West Coast, the San Francisco, Northern California area, close to 90%. And in this way, Vice President Kamala Harris and her husband, Doug Emhoff, lighting a Chanukiah, or what's called in America a menorah, is really emblematic of American Jewry today in many ways, and that reality, and in that way, it's so important to understand that first of all, it's the reality. Number two, some people, certainly Orthodox people, but also non-Orthodox people, may be concerned about what's called exogamy, of marrying non-Jews because of issues of continuity. Nonetheless, there's also a part of it that this is the American dream, that the vice president, who may be the next president, we'll see in our last session, is married to a Jew and lights Hanukkah candles and has a Seder and makes brisket. And her opponent, Donald Trump may not be Jewish by any means, but his daughter converted to Judaism as a modern Orthodox Jew and sends her kids to one of the leading modern Orthodox Jewish camps that is sponsored by Yeshiva University or founded by Yeshiva University, Camp Morashah. And here we have the Jared Kushner, who grew up modern Orthodox. He certainly wanted his wife to not only convert, but to adopt an Orthodox lifestyle and educate their kids that way. But nonetheless, we see that the integration of Jews, when Chelsea Clinton married Mark Mesninsky in 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and they had a ketubah and he wore a talit, people were like, wow, that's crazy. But in a way, this is, we made it. That Americanization is very much expressed here, that Jews can be accepted. Now, we'll talk about anti-Semitism next time, and it's not simple, and yet there's this two-sided sword to this. On one hand, intermarriage has dangers, and it also may compromise certain allegiances because the non-Jewish spouse has less of a lifelong connection to certain Jewish values, and that relates to Israel, and we'll talk about that next week. On the other hand, the sense that in the last couple of years, the elite of America, the Princess Dies of America, are non-Jews married to Jews, or Jews by choice who have integrated into the community. These are things which are very much part of the Jewish reality. And as we see here, each in its other form, and they're different, and I don't want to underemphasize the differences, but these are things that are ubiquitous to all the denominations. And the denominations indeed have adjusted in interesting ways. Within the Reform movement already in 1883, it was clear that this was the trend, and they decided first to recognize that if one Jewish parent was Jewish and they brought their kids Jewish, they voted that patrilineal descent from a father, not just a mother, was a basis for Jewish identity. And that was an adjustment. That was a creative adjustment. They grounded it in their understanding of historical sources, etc. But it was an adjustment to the realities of Jewish life. Comfort and creativity. Comfort and creativity. In parallel, not exactly the same dates, but eventually it was clear that a lot of people, both non-Orthodox people, want to marry non-Jews, and they don't want the non-Jews have very close to their parents, they're close to their families. They're not going to convert to Judaism, but they understand that their Jewish spouse wants to maintain their identity and maybe even bring up their children Jewish, and they will marry in a big ceremony. And here we have a rabbi from Massachusetts talking about, I could officiate at the wedding of a Jew and a non-Jew if together they see their wedding as the beginning of a Jewish home. Now, one of the most interesting creative approaches within the conservative movement that I came across a couple of years ago, and I wrote an article about it, is a new concept, a new hybrid identity called the Karov Yisrael. Karov means close, or it means a relative. The designation, this was actually in the synagogue that unfortunately had the terrible shooting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Tree of Life congregation, where they have in their charter, it says the designation of the non-Jew as a Karov Yisrael, friend of the Jewish people or relative, was adopted to denote a designation of respect and welcoming. An intermarried couple will be accepted into the Tree of Life community as a family with the understanding that any children will be raised as Jews. So all these efforts are efforts at creativity. Certainly the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox will say from a halachic perspective, they're complicated. In this case, they do not acknowledge the non-Jew as a Jew. There are all sorts of debates what privileges they can be. Can they be present in the synagogue? Can they receive an aliyah and bless the Torah? But there is a hybrid identity that is resulting of American Jewish integration and the sense that Jews have become part and parcel of society and go to universities and meet people, etc. And this is that push and pull. And I think the Karov Yisrael is so interesting because it's the conservative movement trying to straddle its loyalty to Jewish law, which does not acknowledge patrilineal descent and does not acknowledge Judaism without conversion, halakha conversion, and yet trying to draw these people into the community. The conservative movement is certainly having difficulty drawing people in most of its congregations, in many of its congregations, not all, some are thriving, but that is an example. And I want to end with something which is very contemporary. Noah Feldman is a really interesting person. He's a really bright, profound professor of law at Harvard University, a commentator formerly in the New York Times and Bloomberg News. He's a constitutional scholar who's been involved in writing constitutions for nascent countries around the world. He's on the National Security Council, I believe. He grew up modern Orthodox in Boston. His father is a professor at Harvard University. His parents are both academics. In a very openly intellectual home, attended a prominent school started by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who I didn't mention, who was a key figure in modern Orthodoxy and the theologue of modern Orthodoxy and the key figure in Yeshiva University, inspiring that integrationist approach for many years until his demise in the late 80s. Noah Feldman grew up in the Maimonides school that Soloveitchik started, where his son and his daughters studied, men and women together, Talmud, Latin, mathematics, Jewish history, Hebrew, Zionism. Noah Feldman chose a different path, and he's written a really interesting book this year that I actually recently reviewed called To Be a Jew Today, A New Guide to God, Israel, and Jewish People, where he talks about the role of God, he talks about the different groups in Jewish life, and he talks about his choice of marrying a non-Jew, and actually his second marriage, marrying a Jew by choice, and his children, and how he communicates issues of Jewish family life, and what does it mean to be a Jew today, and why would someone marry a Jew, and why, in the end of the day, a progressive American Jew today is challenged in this area. And one of the most telling sentences in that whole book is what I brought here. And I think it's very important for understanding the realities and the challenges and in the sense that this is Jewishness for many, many Jews. And this will sort of be a segue also into talking about Israel and some of its values. And I'll read it here. He writes, "It does not feel ethically right to say that we will only marry people who count as us." Because us, and if you make capitalize S, US, because we're Americans, we're not just Jews. The issue, and we are human beings, the issue is not one of willpower, but of ethical values. A Jew can choose not to marry someone who's not Jewish, even if they are in love, but it would violate a core tenet, he argues, giving that love a chance to manifest itself through an aspirational lifetime partnership. Now, in my review, I question the question: is love something that's determinist, or can one fall into love and fall out of love, and to what degree that is a violation? These are interesting questions that I found less compelling, but nonetheless, it is a testimony to the sense that how can a Jew that is formed by the ethics of American life, that accepts a progressive approach, or certainly a liberal approach that is humane, that wants to partner with other people, that wants to be part and parcel of society, how can you tell them that ethically they should not marry the person that they love? Now, this is an important statement. And imagine you're the rabbi. Imagine you're the communal leader. Imagine you are the parent. These are the discussions. And yes, denominations have created impressively original ways to navigate them, but they are certainly an area in which there is both interface between religion and family, and at the same time, there is a clash and a very complicated dialectic that is going on. Next time, we will talk about Zionism and anti-Semitism. Thank you so much for your patience.